Black smoke belched from the Union Pacific train as it shrieked against the iron rails, scarring the pristine Wyoming sky with a cargo of desperate hopes and paper-thin promises. Silas Montgomery stood rigid on the Cheyenne Depot platform, a matrimonial contract burning a hole in his denim pocket. He had paid for a strong, young bride to help tame the brutal Broken Spur Ranch. Yet, when the engine's dust finally settled, the woman who stepped down wasn't alone. Beside her clung a frail, trembling old mother. On a ruthless frontier where every extra mouth was a calculation of survival, a dependent was practically a death sentence. Destiny, however, paired with a cowboy's ironclad honor, had entirely different plans. The year was 1883, and Cheyenne, Wyoming, was a town built on cattle, railroad money, and the sweat of men who didn't know how to quit. Alexander Montgomery was one of them. At 34, his face was already weathered into the texture of old saddle leather, his eyes the color of a winter sky, pale, sharp, and used to looking at empty horizons. He had built the Broken Spur with his bare hands, a sprawling cattle operation 30 miles north of town, but a ranch that size was too much for one man, and a timber house felt like a tomb without the warmth of a family. He had placed the advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer 6 months prior. Wanted, a woman of good moral character, willing to work hard and build a life in the West. Matrimony guaranteed upon arrival. Clara Higgins had answered. Her letters were pragmatic, devoid of the flowery romance Alexander detested. She wrote of her willingness to learn, her strong back, and her desire for a fresh start. She had sent a tintype, a handsome woman with dark hair pulled severely back and eyes that held a quiet storm. Now, standing on the depot platform, Alexander watched the passengers disembark. Drummers in cheap suits, cowboys returning from trail drives, and finally, a woman in a faded, dust-covered navy dress. It was Clara. She looked exactly like her tintype, perhaps a bit thinner, the hollows of her cheeks pronounced by the grueling journey. Alexander stepped forward, taking off his Stetson. "Miss Higgins." Clara jumped slightly, her dark eyes snapping to his. She took a breath, her chest rising and falling beneath the heavy wool of her bodice. "Mr. Montgomery, it is a relief to finally meet you." Her voice was softer than he expected, carrying the refined cadence of the East Coast, though frayed at the edges with exhaustion. Alexander nodded, reaching for the canvas grip at her feet. "I have the wagon hitched around back. We should get moving before the sun dips." "Wait," Clara said, her voice suddenly tight, laced with a panic that made Alexander pause. She turned back toward the train car. From the shadows of the vestibule emerged an elderly woman. She was tiny, practically bird-like, wrapped in a threadbare shawl that offered no protection against the biting Wyoming wind. Her hair was stark white, and she leaned heavily on a carved wooden cane. She moved with agonizing slowness, her hands trembling as she grasped the iron handrail. Clara rushed to the steps, wrapping an arm around the old woman's waist to ease her down to the wooden platform. Alexander froze. The contract said nothing about a mother. In the West, you didn't bring burdens unless they could pull their weight. The winters here killed strong men. They would devour a frail old woman in weeks. A cold knot of betrayal formed in his gut. She had lied by omission. "Mr. Montgomery," Clara said, turning to face him. Her chin was tipped up in a gesture of absolute, terrifying defiance, though her lower lip trembled. "This is my mother, Martha Higgins." Martha offered a small, dignified nod, though her eyes, a faded, milky blue, darted nervously around the rough frontier town. "A pleasure, Mr. Montgomery," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves. Alexander stared at Clara. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating beneath the noise of the bustling depot. "Your letters," Alexander began, his voice dropping an octave, a dangerous rumble in his chest. "You never mentioned a mother." "I know," Clara said, stepping slightly in front of Martha, a physical shield against his impending rejection. "And I ask your forgiveness for the deception. But I could not leave her in Philadelphia. We have no one else. If you are a man of your word, you will take me. I will work twice as hard. I will do the chores of 2 men to make up for her keep. But where I go, she goes." Alexander looked at the 2 women. They were terrified. He could see it in the white-knuckle grip Clara had on her mother's shawl. They had traveled 2,000 miles into the unknown, gambling everything on a stranger's mercy. The logical part of his brain, the part that kept him alive through blizzards and droughts, screamed at him to put them back on the train, give them $100 and wash his hands of it. He looked at Martha. She wasn't looking at him with pity or begging. She was looking at him with a quiet, heartbreaking resignation, expecting the worst from a man. Alexander let out a long, slow breath, a puff of white in the chilly air. He shoved his Stetson back onto his head and reached out, smoothly taking Martha's small carpet bag in one hand and Clara's heavy grip in the other. "The wagon is this way," Alexander said gruffly. Clara blinked, stunned. You aren't sending us back?" Alexander paused, looking over his shoulder at the fierce, desperate young woman who was to be his wife. "A contract is a contract, Miss Higgins. And my home has room for both." The ride to the Broken Spur was a grueling 4-hour journey across a sea of sagebrush and endless, rolling plains. The silence in the wagon was thick enough to cut with a bowie knife. Alexander drove the team of bays, his eyes fixed on the horizon, while Clara and Martha huddled together in the back, wrapped in heavy buffalo robes Alexander had provided. When the silhouette of the Broken Spur finally appeared against the twilight sky, a sturdy 2-story log and timber house, a massive barn, and miles of split-rail fencing, Alexander heard a soft gasp from the back of the wagon. "It's so empty out here," Clara whispered, the vastness of the prairie finally settling over her. "It's peaceful," Alexander corrected, pulling the team to a halt in front of the porch. "Welcome to the Broken Spur." He helped Martha down first. She was lighter than a sack of flour, her bones feeling fragile as glass beneath his large hands. As Clara climbed down, she stumbled on the hem of her dress. Alexander caught her by the waist. For a second, she was pressed against his chest. She smelled of coal dust, old lavender, and sheer terror. He released her immediately, stepping back. "I'll show you to your rooms. We'll speak to the preacher in town come Monday," Alexander said, turning toward the door. The marriage was a business arrangement, but as he watched Clara gently guide her mother up the wooden steps, Alexander realized this business was going to be far more complicated than he had ever bargained for. The first month at the Broken Spur was a brutal collision of 2 entirely different worlds. Clara was a city girl, accustomed to cobblestones, corner grocers, and indoor plumbing. Wyoming offered none of those luxuries. Alexander's home, though well-built and weather-tight, was utilitarian and bare. True to her word, Clara threw herself into the work with a manic desperation that both impressed and worried Alexander. She woke before dawn, wrestling with the heavy cast-iron stove to get the fire going. She burned her hands, scorched the biscuits, and once, Alexander caught her crying silently behind the chicken coop after a particularly aggressive rooster had chased her, but she never complained. When Alexander walked into the kitchen, she quickly wiped her face, plastered on a strained smile, and asked what chores needed doing next. The real surprise, however, was Martha. Alexander had expected the old woman to be bedridden, a constant drain on Clara's already taxed energy. Instead, Martha proved to be made of tougher stuff. She claimed the rocking chair by the hearth, but her hands were never idle. She mended Alexander's torn work shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She peeled mountains of potatoes, snapped beans, and hummed old Irish folk tunes that somehow made the cavernous timber house feel less empty. One evening in late October, as the first bitter frosts began to coat the prairie in silver, Alexander sat at the heavy oak dining table, cleaning his Winchester rifle. Clara was washing dishes, the smell of lye soap filling the room. Martha was knitting. "You're too hard on the girl, Mr. Montgomery," Martha said suddenly, not looking up from her needles. Alexander paused, the oil rag stalling on the rifle barrel. He looked at Clara's back, stiffening at the sink. "I haven't said a harsh word to her, Mrs. Higgins." "That's exactly the problem," Martha countered, her needle clicking rhythmically. "You treat her like a hired hand." Not a wife. She works herself to the bone, trying to earn her keep because you haven't made her feel like she belongs here. She's terrified you'll cast us out. Mother, please, Clara hissed, her face burning red as she turned around, wiping her raw, soapy hands on her apron. Mr. Montgomery has been more than generous. Alexander set the rifle down. He looked at Clara. Really, looked at her. Her hair was falling out of its neat bun. Her knuckles were chapped and bleeding from the harsh lie, and there were dark circles under her eyes. He had married her, legally, in front of Reverend Stokes 3 weeks ago, but they slept in separate rooms. He had been so focused on getting the ranch ready for winter, and so wary of this sudden instant family, that he had kept an emotional wall 10 feet high between them. Clara, Alexander said, his voice softer than usual. She flinched slightly, unaccustomed to him using her given name. Sit down. Reluctantly, she sat opposite him at the table. I don't expect you to earn your place here, Alexander said, looking her dead in the eye. When I said my home had room for both of you, I meant it. You are my wife. This is your home. You don't have to work yourself into an early grave to prove you belong. Clara swallowed hard, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. For the first time, the rigid posture she maintained seemed to crack. I don't want to be a burden, Alexander. It was the first time she had used his first name. It sounded strange, yet right, rolling off her tongue. A spark of genuine connection flared between them, cutting through the cold room. Alexander reached across the table, his large, calloused hand gently covering her small, raw ones. You aren't, he promised. Things shifted after that night. The tension in the house eased. Alexander began showing Clara how to ride the gentler horses. He laughed when she fell off, a deep, rumbling sound that made Clara's stomach do a strange flutter, and she laughed too, dusting off her skirts. She started asking him about his life before, and he told her about his late father, about the harsh winters, and the beauty of the spring thaw. A tentative, slow-burning romance began to weave its way through their daily chores, but the peace was fragile, and it shattered a week before Thanksgiving. Alexander had ridden out to intercept the stagecoach that dropped mail at the crossroads 10 miles away. He brought back a small bundle of letters and a package of coffee. He tossed the mail onto the kitchen table while Clara was pulling bread from the oven. Mail call, Alexander said, pouring himself a cup of leftover morning coffee. Mostly seed catalogs. But there's a letter for you, Clara. Clara turned, a smile on her face. But the moment her eyes landed on the envelope, the color completely drained from her cheeks. The heavy iron pan in her hand slipped, clattering loudly onto the stovetop, narrowly missing her foot. Clara? Alexander stepped forward, alarmed. Fine, she blurted out, her voice unnaturally high. She practically lunged for the table, snatching the letter and shoving it deep into the pocket of her apron. Just slipped. Alexander frowned. He had caught a glimpse of the return address before she grabbed it. It was postmarked Philadelphia, with heavy, aggressive, black ink handwriting. Bad news from back east? He asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. No. Clara lied, her breathing shallow. Just an old friend. Nothing important. I have to check on the chickens. She bolted from the kitchen, leaving the fresh bread burning on the stove. Alexander stood there, the silence ringing in his ears. He looked over at Martha, who had stopped her knitting. The old woman's face was ashen. Her eyes locked on the door Clara had just sprinted through. Martha? Alexander asked, his voice low and demanding. What is going on? Martha closed her eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath. The past. Alexander. It has a nasty habit of catching a train west. Winter hit the Wyoming plains with the ferocity of a wild dog. By early December, the broken spur was buried under 3 feet of snow, and the temperature had plummeted to a degree where inhaling too sharply felt like swallowing broken glass. The harsh weather forced Alexander, Clara, and Martha into an isolated, intimate proximity. The house smelled perpetually of wood smoke, baking bread, and the liniment Martha rubbed into her aching joints. Despite the cold outside, A warmth had grown inside the cabin. Clara and Alexander had moved past their awkward beginnings. On the nights when the wind howled like a banshee around the eaves, Alexander would sit on the rug near the fire, mending harnesses, while Clara read aloud from a worn copy of Dickens she had brought from the city. He found himself mesmerized not just by the stories, but by the cadence of her voice, the way the firelight caught the red undertones in her dark hair, and the gentle curve of her neck. One evening, while Martha was asleep in her room, Alexander reached out and gently took the book from Clara's hands, setting it on the floor. He pulled her down beside him on the rug. The kiss started slow, a hesitant exploration of boundaries, but quickly deepened, fueled by months of suppressed desire and the heavy, intoxicating isolation of the blizzard. She tasted of cinnamon and salt, and when her hands buried into his hair, Alexander felt a piece of his soul frozen since he buried his first wife years ago finally thaw. That night, Clara moved her belongings into his room. They became a true husband and wife in every sense, clinging to each other in the dark, finding solace in the warmth of shared blankets and shared breaths. But even as their love blossomed, a dark shadow lingered at the edges of Clara's smile. Alexander noticed the way she flinched whenever a heavy branch scraped against the window. He noticed how she stared out at the snow-covered road for hours, her expression tight with dread. And he hadn't forgotten the letter. He had never brought it up, waiting for her to trust him enough to tell him herself. But her silence was beginning to rot the foundation of their newly built trust. In mid-December, a break in the weather offered a brief window for travel. The sky cleared to a brilliant, blinding blue. Alexander hitched the heavy draft horses to the sleigh. They were running dangerously low on flour, coffee, and kerosene, and he needed to make the grueling trek into Cheyenne before the next system moved in. "I'll be back by tomorrow night," Alexander told Clara, kissing her forehead as he wrapped a heavy wool scarf around his neck. "Keep the doors barred. Don't go out to the barn unless you absolutely have to. The snowdrifts are treacherous." "Be careful, Alexander," Clara whispered, gripping his coat lapels tighter than necessary. "Please, hurry back. Always," he promised. The journey to Cheyenne was slow and punishing, but Alexander made it by mid-afternoon. The town was half buried, the wooden sidewalks shoveled into narrow, icy trenches. Alexander tied the team at the livery and made his way to O'Malley's general store. The store was warm, smelling of peppermint sticks, chewing tobacco, and wet wool. Alexander stamped the snow off his boots and approached the counter where old man O'Malley was tallying a ledger. "Alexander Montgomery," O'Malley croaked, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "Didn't expect to see you till spring. Heard you took a bride." "I did, Amber." "Need to stock up for 3 now," Alexander said, handing over his list. As O'Malley turned to pull sacks of flour from the back, Alexander wandered toward the warmth of the potbelly stove in the center of the room. A few other ranchers were huddled around it, nursing cups of black coffee. "Say, Alexander," muttered Jebediah Miller, a rancher whose property bordered the broken spur to the south. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about a fella asking around town yesterday, would ya?" Alexander turned, wiping melting snow from his brow. "What kind of fella? Easterner?" "Wearing a bowler hat and a coat nicer than anything I've ever seen," Jebediah said, spitting a stream of tobacco into a brass spittoon. Had a cold look about him. He was asking Sheriff Bodie and anyone who'd listen about 2 women. Said they came out from Philadelphia a few months back. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face, his heart seizing in his chest. "Did he give a name?" "Said his name was Josiah Rollins," Jebediah replied, oblivious to the sudden tension radiating from Alexander. "Said he was looking for a Clara Higgins and her mother. Claimed they owed him a substantial sum of money. A debt. Sheriff Bodie told him he didn't keep a roster of every mail-order bride that passed through, but the fella was persistent, offering a $50 gold piece to anyone who could point him in the right direction. $50. In 1883, that was more than some cowboys made in a year. Someone would talk. It was only a matter of time before someone remembered Alexander picking up the 2 women at the depot. Alexander didn't wait for O'Malley to finish packing his order. He threw a wad of cash on the counter. "Loaded in the sleigh at the livery," Amber, I've got to go see the sheriff. Alexander marched through the snow-packed streets to the sheriff's office. He slammed the heavy oak door open. Sheriff Bodie, a man with a graying walrus mustache and a permanent scowl, looked up from his desk. Alexander. Close the damn door. You're letting the winter in. Bodie grumbled. Jebediah says there's a man looking for my wife, Alexander said, cutting straight to the chase, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Bodie sighed, setting down his pen. Josiah Rollins. Yeah. He was here. Alexander, this fella isn't just a debt collector. I did some wire checking. Rollins runs half the illegal gambling and loan sharking operations in Philadelphia. He's got politicians in his pocket and thugs on his payroll. What the hell kind of trouble is your wife in? I don't know, Alexander admitted, the truth tasting like ash in his mouth. But she's my wife, and no Eastern slicker is going to touch her. He's got legal papers, Alexander. Bodie warned, leaning forward. Promissory note signed by Clara Higgins. If she owes him money, he has a legal right to collect, or drag her back to face a judge. If you shoot him, it's murder. I can't protect you from the law. I'll handle it, Alexander said coldly, turning on his heel. The ride back to the Broken Spur was a blur of frantic anxiety. Alexander pushed the team as hard as he dared, the sleigh runners cutting deep, icy grooves into the snow. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the prairie into a frozen, starry blackness. His mind was a storm of anger and fear. Clara had lied. She hadn't just brought her mother. She had brought a monster to his doorstep. It was nearly midnight when the silhouette of the Broken Spur appeared. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a beacon of domestic peace that felt entirely mocking now. Alexander burst through the front door, bringing a flurry of snow into the warm kitchen. Clara was asleep in the rocking chair by the dying fire, a quilt pulled over her. She jolted awake at the noise, her face lighting up with relief. Alexander, you're back early, Where is the letter? Alexander interrupted, his voice echoing off the timber walls, stripped of all the warmth he had shown her over the past month. Clara froze, the quilt slipping from her shoulders. What? The letter? Clara, the one from Philadelphia. Get it. Now. Martha's bedroom door creaked open, the old woman stepping out in her nightgown, leaning heavily on her cane, her eyes wide with alarm. Clara trembled, seeing the fury in her husband's eyes. She walked slowly to the hutch, opened a small drawer, and pulled out the crumpled envelope. She handed it to him, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. Alexander ripped the letter from the envelope and held it to the light of the kerosene lamp. It was brief, written in sharp, aggressive strokes. Clara, did you think you could run fast enough? The debt is not forgiven. Your father's sins are your own. I am coming to collect, with interest. J. Rollins. Alexander crumpled the paper in his fist, his jaw locked. A man named Josiah Rollins is in Cheyenne. Clara, he's asking for you. He's offering a $50 bounty for your location. Sheriff Bodie says you owe him money. A lot of it. Clara let out a choked sob, sinking into one of the dining chairs, burying her face in her hands. You used me, Alexander said, the betrayal cutting deeper than the Wyoming cold. You didn't answer my ad to find a husband. You answered it to find a hideout. No, Clara cried, looking up, tears streaming down her face. No, Alexander, please. I love you. That wasn't a lie. None of what we have is a lie. Then tell me the truth, Alexander roared, slamming his fist on the table, making the lamp rattle dangerously. Who is Josiah Rollins, and why is a Philadelphia crime boss hunting my wife? Martha stepped forward, her cane thumping dully on the floorboards. She looked at Alexander, her old eyes hardened with a grim, tragic resolve. Don't yell at her, Alexander. The debt isn't hers. It's mine. Alexander whipped his head to look at the frail elderly woman. What? My husband Clara's father was a good man, but a weak one, Martha began, her voice steady despite the tears pooling in her eyes. He was a clerk, but he had a sickness for the cards. He borrowed money from Rollins to cover his losses, thinking he could win it back. he didn't. When he couldn't pay, Rollins' men beat him so badly he died of his injuries 3 days later. Clara was weeping silently now, nodding along. But the debt didn't die with him, Martha continued, her voice turning bitter. Rollins came to us. Said the debt transferred to the widow. It was $5,000, Alexander. We sold everything we owned, the house, the furniture, but it barely covered a fraction. Then, Rollins looked at Clara. Martha choked on a sob, her knuckles white on her cane. He told me he would forgive the debt if I gave Clara to him. To be his property, to do with as he pleased. Alexander felt a cold, murderous rage wash over him, entirely eclipsing his previous anger at Clara. We ran, Clara whispered, looking up at him with red, swollen eyes. We saw your ad. It was the furthest place we could get to with the few dollars we had left. I didn't mean to bring this to your door, Alexander. I swear to God, if he's here, I will leave. I will pack my things and surrender to him tomorrow. I won't let him hurt you or take your ranch. Alexander stared at the two women, the woman he had fallen in love with, and the mother she had sacrificed everything to protect. They were trembling, expecting him to cast them out, expecting the harsh frontier justice of every man for himself. Alexander walked over to the stove. He opened the iron door and tossed Rollins's letter into the flames. He watched it curl, turn black, and disintegrate into ash. Then, he turned back to Clara. He walked over to her, knelt on the floor in front of her chair, and took her trembling, tear-soaked face in his large, rough hands. When you arrived at that train station, Alexander said, his voice quiet, steady, and vibrating with an ironclad resolve. I told you my home had room for both of you. You are a Montgomery now, and out here, we protect our own. He stood up, looking toward the window, where the wind was beginning to howl again, signaling the return of the storm. Rollins thinks he's bringing hell to our doorstep, Alexander said, his eyes narrowing into a lethal squint. But he's a city boy who doesn't know the first thing about a Wyoming winter, or a Wyoming man. He looked at Martha. Get the rifles, Mrs. Higgins. It's time Clara learned how to shoot. The following morning, the Wyoming wind howled a bleak, lonesome tune, rattling the timber frames of the broken spur. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of gun oil and brewing coffee. Alexander stood at the heavy oak table, breaking down a pair of Colt single-action Army revolvers and a Winchester 1873 rifle. Clara stood beside him, her face pale but her jaw set in a hard, unfamiliar line. The soft, terrified girl from Philadelphia was gone, buried under the weight of the previous night's revelation. The Winchester has a kick that will bruise your shoulder if you don't hold it tight against the pocket, Alexander instructed, his voice a calm, steady baritone. He handed her the unloaded rifle. Seat it. Keep both eyes open. When you pull the trigger, don't jerk it. Squeeze it like you're wringing out a sponge. Clara lifted the heavy weapon. It wavered slightly before she braced her stance, pulling the stock tight against her shoulder. She aimed at the mounted deer head above the hearth. Like this? Alexander stepped behind her, his chest brushing her back. He reached out, his calloused hands adjusting her grip on the barrel. Lower your elbow. Breathe in. Let half of it out. Then hold. That's your window. He stepped back. I won't lie to you, Clara. If Rollins sent men ahead, they aren't going to knock politely. They're coming for a bounty, which means they're ruthless, and they won't care who gets caught in the crossfire. Martha watched from her rocking chair, a patchwork quilt draped over her knees. Josiah doesn't do his own dirty work. He'll have hired muscle, men who'd slit a throat for $1. Let them come, Alexander muttered, loading a fresh cartridge into the Colt. They're on my land now. For 3 days, the storm kept them barricaded. The isolation was maddening. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the snow on the roof sent Clara's heart into her throat. Alexander barely slept, keeping watch by the frosted window panes, a steaming mug of coffee his only companion in the dark. On the afternoon of the 4th day, The sky finally broke, revealing a blinding, sunlit expanse of white. Alexander was out in the barn, breaking ice in the water troughs for the horses, when the sharp, unnatural crack of a snapping branch echoed from the tree line. Alexander dropped the iron spud. He drew his Colt, peering through the slats of the barn wall. 3 riders were pushing their mounts hard through the deep drifts, heading straight for the house. They wore heavy wool dusters, their faces obscured by scarves and low-pulled Stetsons. But the way they rode spread out, hands hovering near their hips screamed trouble. Alexander sprinted from the barn, his boots sinking knee-deep into the snow. "Clara! Bar the door!" he roared, waving his arm as he ran toward the porch. The front door slammed shut, just as the riders pulled up 50 yards from the house. The lead man, a burly brute with a scarred cheek visible above his scarf, pulled his horse up short. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the pristine snow. "Alexander Montgomery," the man shouted, his voice carrying clearly on the crisp air. "I'm Virgil Hobbs. We're looking for a woman named Higgins. Word in Cheyenne is you bought her off a train." Alexander stood on the porch, his rifle resting casually, yet lethally, across his forearm. "There's no Higgins here. Only my wife, Mrs. Montgomery. And you're trespassing. Turn around." Virgil chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. He threw a folded piece of parchment onto the snow. "I got a legal writ here, Montgomery. Sworn by a judge in Pennsylvania. She owes a debt to Mr. Josiah Rollins. We're here to collect her and the old bat. A piece of paper from 2,000 miles away doesn't mean spit in Wyoming," Alexander said, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. "I'm telling you once. Leave." The rider to Virgil's left, a twitchy, lean man, snickered. "He thinks he can take all 3 of us. Virg, take the house," Virgil commanded, dropping his hand to his holster. The silence of the prairie shattered. Alexander fired before Virgil could clear leather. The Winchester barked, spitting smoke and lead. The bullet took the twitchy man square in the shoulder, throwing him backward off his horse with a scream. Virgil and the 3rd man spurred their horses, peeling off in opposite directions, firing wildly at the porch. Wood splintered around Alexander's head as he dove behind the heavy timber railing. He pumped the lever of the Winchester, tracking Virgil's horse through the snow. Suddenly, a shot rang out from the house. Alexander whipped his head around. The kitchen window was smashed open. Clara stood there, the heavy buffalo rifle Alexander had left her resting on the sill, smoke curling from the barrel. Out in the snow, the 3rd rider's horse reared, dumping its rider into a deep drift as the bullet kicked up a spray of ice inches from his boots. The man scrambled, terrified by the heavy artillery, and began running on foot toward the tree line. Virgil, seeing his men routed, cursed violently. He snapped off one last shot toward the window. "Clara, get down," Alexander yelled. The bullet shattered the wooden frame just inches from Clara's face. She ducked, crying out as a shard of glass grazed her cheek. Seeing Clara in danger, snapped something primal inside Alexander. He stood up, completely exposing himself to Virgil's line of fire, raised the Winchester, and fired twice. The first bullet took Virgil's hat clean off. The second grazed his horse's flank. The animal panicked, bucking wildly and tearing off toward the county road, taking a swearing Virgil with it. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the whimpers of the wounded man bleeding out in the snow. Alexander bolted through the front door. Clara was sitting on the kitchen floor, breathing heavily, a thin line of blood trickling down her pale cheek. "Are you hit?" Alexander demanded, dropping to his knees, his hands frantically checking her shoulders, her arms. "No," Clara gasped, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in his coat. "Just the glass. I'm fine." "Alexander, I shot at a man." "You did," Alexander whispered, holding her tight, pressing a kiss into her dark hair. "You saved my life." Martha hobbled into the kitchen, her face grim. "They're gone? For now," Alexander said, helping Clara to her feet. He looked out the shattered window at the vast, uncaring landscape. But they'll be back, and next time, Rollins will come himself. The wounded man in the snow didn't survive the night. He bled out before Alexander could even drag him to the barn. They buried him the next morning beneath the frozen earth, a grim marker of the violence that had infected their sanctuary. Tension hung over the broken spur like a suffocating blanket. Alexander spent his days fortifying the ranch, boarding up the lower windows and keeping a loaded rifle in every room. Clara's hands, once steady with domestic chores, now shook as she prepared meals, her eyes constantly darting to the horizon. 2 weeks passed. Christmas came and went, with a quiet, somber dinner. There were no carols, no joy, only the waiting. It was mid-January when the storm finally broke. Not with snow, but with a convoy. Alexander was repairing a bridle in the living room when the low, rhythmic rumble of heavy wheels reached his ears. He stood up, grabbing his Winchester. Clara and Martha froze. Alexander walked to the narrow slit he had left in the boarded-up window. A black, custom-built Concorde stagecoach, flanked by 6 heavily armed men on horseback, was pulling into the yard. The men weren't ragged bounty hunters. They wore tailored wool coats and carried repeating rifles. This was Eastern money. This was an army. The coach door opened, and a man stepped out into the blinding snow. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, a velvet-collared overcoat, and a black bowler hat. He carried a silver-tipped walking stick, stepping over the icy mud with an air of aristocratic disgust. "Josiah Rollins," Martha whispered from behind Alexander, her voice trembling with absolute terror. He came. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Stay here. Both of you. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." He stepped out onto the porch, locking the heavy door behind him. The bitter wind whipped his duster around his legs. The 6 riders fanned out, their rifles resting casually but purposefully in their hands. Josiah Rollins stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He was a handsome man, perhaps in his late 40s, with silver hair at his temples and eyes as black and flat as obsidian. He offered a polite, utterly soulless smile. "Mr. Montgomery, I presume," Rollins said, his voice smooth and cultured, carrying none of the frontier drawl. "I must apologize for the theatrics. I sent Mr. Hobbs to handle this quietly, but it appears you lack an understanding of legal obligation." "There are no obligations here," Alexander replied, his thumb resting on the hammer of his Winchester. "You're trespassing, Rollins, and I don't care how many hired guns you brought. You take one step on my porch, you won't live to take a second." Rollins chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He leaned on his cane. "Such frontier bravado. It's quaint, really. But let us talk business. Your wife's father, a pathetic wretch named Thomas, owed me $5,000. With interest, the sum is now $7,000. I am a businessman, Mr. Montgomery. I am simply here to collect my property. A woman isn't property. She is when she serves as collateral," Rollins sneered, the polite facade cracking. "I offered the widow a deal. Give me the girl, and the debt is cleared. Clara is beautiful. She would have fetched a high price in certain private clubs in Philadelphia. Instead, they ran, making a mockery of me." Alexander's blood ran cold. The sheer depravity of the man turned his stomach. "She's my wife. The debt is dead." "The debt is never dead," Rollins barked. He gestured to his men, who cocked their rifles in unison. "I have 50 men on payroll back east, Montgomery. I have the judges in my pocket. You have a wooden shack and a rifle. Give me the women, or I will burn this ranch to the ground with you inside it." Before Alexander could react, the heavy click of the front door unlocking echoed loudly. Alexander turned, horrified. "Clara, I told you to stay inside." But it wasn't Clara. It was Martha. The frail old woman stepped onto the porch, the bitter cold instantly biting through her thin shawl. She leaned heavily on her cane, but her head was held high, her eyes burning with a fierce, unnatural fire. In her free hand, she clutched a thick, leather-bound book. Rollins's smug smile vanished the second he saw the book. His face drained of color, his black eyes widening in sudden, panicked recognition. "Hello, Josiah," Martha said, her voice carrying over the wind. "You," Rollins stammered, pointing a gloved finger at her. "You stole it. I scoured the city for that." "What is that?" Alexander asked, keeping his eyes on the armed men. "Insurance," Martha replied coldly. She looked down at Rollins. "Before Thomas died, he told me where you kept your private ledger, Josiah. The real one. The one that documents every bribe paid to a federal judge, every illegal land grab, every murder you ordered. When we ran, I didn't just pack clothes. I packed your noose." Rollins's face contorted with rage. "You stupid old crone. If you hand that over, I might let you live." "I don't plan on living much longer anyway," Martha scoffed. "But I made a copy, Josiah, a full transcript. And before the winter storms hit, I mailed it." Rollins froze. "You're lying." "Am I?" Martha challenged, a grim smile playing on her lips. "I sent it to Pinkerton's National Detective Agency in Chicago, with a letter stating that if they did not hear from Clara or myself by the spring thaw, they were to deliver it directly to the Attorney General." The silence that followed was heavier than the snow. The hired guns looked at each other, their confidence suddenly wavering. Pinkertons and federal marshals weren't local sheriffs you could bribe. They were a death sentence. "If you kill us, Josiah," Martha continued, her voice echoing like a judge's gavel, "the Pinkertons will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Your empire will crumble. You will hang." Rollins stared at the frail woman, his chest heaving. The arithmetic of power had just violently shifted. He looked at Alexander, whose rifle was still dead steady, and then at the leather book in Martha's hand. "This isn't over," Rollins hissed, his voice venomous. "Yes, it is," Alexander said quietly. "Get off my land." Rollins stood there for a long, agonizing moment. Then, with a furious, jerky motion, he turned his back on them. He climbed into the stagecoach and slammed the door. He didn't issue an order, but his men knew a retreat when they saw one. They holstered their weapons and turned their horses around. Alexander didn't lower his rifle until the black stagecoach was nothing but a speck against the vast white horizon. He let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for a month. He turned to Martha. The old woman's legs finally gave out. She collapsed against the porch railing, dropping the heavy leather book. Alexander caught her before she hit the floorboards. Clara rushed out the door, tears streaming down her face, dropping to her knees beside her mother. "Mama, what did you do?" Martha looked up at Alexander, a weak, triumphant smile on her wrinkled face. "I told you, Mr. Montgomery, the past has a nasty habit of catching a train west. I just made sure I packed the right ammunition." The silence that followed Josiah Rollins's departure was fragile, practically vibrating with the adrenaline still coursing through the veins of the three people standing on the porch of the broken spur. Alexander lowered his Winchester, his breath pluming in the freezing air, but his eyes never left the horizon where the black Concord stagecoach had disappeared into the white expanse. Clara was weeping softly, her arms wrapped tight around her mother's frail shoulders. Martha, however, was not crying. The fierce, terrifying fire that had animated her during the confrontation was slowly draining away, leaving her looking older and more fragile than ever. She leaned heavily against Alexander's arm as he helped her back inside the timber house, locking the heavy oak door behind them. "You played a dangerous hand, Mrs. Higgins," Alexander said, guiding her to the rocking chair by the hearth. He immediately began tossing fresh pine logs onto the dying embers, needing the fire to roar, needing something to push back the bone-deep chill of the encounter. "I played the only hand we had, Alexander," Martha wheezed, her chest rattling. She looked down at the heavy, leather-bound ledger resting on her lap. The gold embossing on the spine was faded, but the weight of the sins recorded on its pages was palpable. Clara knelt beside her mother, wiping her soot-stained cheeks. "But it worked, Mama. You sent the copy to the Pinkertons. As soon as it reaches Chicago, the Attorney General will issue a federal warrant. Rollins can't touch us without signing his own death warrant." Martha closed her eyes. A single tear escaped, cutting a clean path through the dust on her wrinkled face. "Oh, my sweet girl," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fresh, devastating wave of fear. "There is no copy." Alexander froze, the iron poker in his hand hovering over the flames. He turned his head slowly. "What did you say?" "I couldn't make a copy," Martha confessed, her hands shaking as she clutched the book. "When Thomas died, I barely had time to find this original ledger under the floorboards of his study before Rollins's men tore the house apart. We fled with the clothes on our backs and this book wrapped in my petticoats. I bluffed him, Alexander. I had to. The air in the cabin seemed to thin out, suffocating them all." Alexander stood up, running a calloused hand over his jaw. The implications hit him like a physical blow. "Rollins is a rattlesnake," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly quiet. "He's retreating now because he believes the Pinkertons have the noose ready. But a man like that doesn't just run. He verifies. The moment he gets back to Cheyenne, he's going to use his money to tear the post office apart looking for a log of that package. He'll wire his men in Chicago to watch the agency. It won't take him more than 48 hours to realize he's been played. And when he does," Clara realized, the color completely draining from her face, "he'll come back, and he won't bother talking." "No," Alexander agreed, grabbing his heavy wool duster from the peg by the door. "He'll bring 50 men and burn the broken spur to the ground while we sleep." He turned to the two women. The illusion of safety was shattered. They were standing on a powder keg, and the fuse was already lit. "Get your heavy coats," Alexander ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Pack every round of ammunition we have. We are leaving." "Leaving?" Clara gasped. "Into the storm?" "Alexander, the drifts are 10 feet high in the gullies. Mama can't survive that ride." "She won't survive Rollins," Alexander countered grimly. "We can't wait for him to figure out the bluff. We have to make the threat real. We are taking that ledger to Cheyenne ourselves. We're giving it to you. S. Marshal Harrison Caldwell. Caldwell is an old-breed lawman. He fought at Antietam. He doesn't take bribes, and he despises Eastern syndicates. If we hand him this book, he'll lock Rollins in a federal holding cell before the sun sets." It was a desperate, suicidal gamble. The road to Cheyenne was a frozen hellscape, and they would be traveling right behind the men who wanted them dead. By nightfall, the sleigh was hitched to the heavy draft horses. Alexander layered the bed with thick buffalo hides and heated river stones to keep Martha from freezing to death. Clara sat beside her, clutching the leather ledger to her chest beneath her wool coat, a loaded Colt revolver resting in her lap. The journey was a waking nightmare. The wind howled across the Wyoming plains, a merciless, shrieking force that bit through their clothes and froze the moisture on their eyelashes. Alexander drove the team relentlessly, his eyes straining through the blowing snow, navigating by the faint silhouettes of the black hills in the distance. Every shadow looked like a hired gun. Every crack of ice sounded like a rifle shot. It took them 14 agonizing hours to cover the 30 miles. By the time the jagged rooflines of Cheyenne appeared through the gray morning light, the horses were lathered in frozen sweat, and Martha was barely conscious, her lips tinged blue. Alexander didn't take them to the main street. He skirted the edge of town, pulling the sleigh into the alleyway behind Amber O'Malley's general store. "Stay low," Alexander whispered to Clara, helping her carry her mother into the back room of the store, where Old Man O'Malley was just stoking the morning fire. Amber jumped, nearly dropping his iron poker. "Alexander, what in God's name?" "Hide them, Amber," Alexander demanded, his eyes wild and bloodshot from the wind. "Lock the back door. Don't let anyone in. If anyone asks, you haven't seen us." "Alexander, the town is swarming," Amber hissed, grabbing blankets to throw over Martha. "That Eastern fella, Rollins, he and his men have been tearing the place apart since midnight. They held Postmaster Tully at gunpoint, going through the outgoing mail logs." "They know, Alexander. They know the old woman lied." Alexander felt a cold spike of dread pierce his stomach. They were out of time. "Where is the marshal?" Alexander asked, checking the action on his Winchester. "Caldwell is at the telegraph office," Amber replied, his hands shaking. "He's trying to wire the governor for deputies, but Rollins has men stationed at both ends of the street." Alexander turned to Clara. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the frost on her cheeks. "Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but me or Marshal Caldwell. If Rollins finds you—" He paused, swallowing hard, unable to voice the thought. "I have the Colt, Alexander," Clara said, her voice trembling but her dark eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering resolve. "I won't let him take us back." Alexander kissed her, hard and desperate, tasting the salt of her tears. "I love you, Clara Montgomery. I'm coming back for you." Morning light spilled across Cheyenne, glinting off the snow and painting the town in a false calm. Alexander stepped out from a narrow alley, Winchester in hand, Colt resting at his hip. His hat was pulled low, his pace steady as he walked down the center of the silent street toward the telegraph office. People watched from behind frosted windows, sensing trouble before it arrived. He hadn't gone far when 3 men stepped into his path, dusters heavy, hands hovering near their guns. "Montgomery," one called. "Mr. Rollins wants his book." Alexander didn't slow. "Tell him I'm done talking." The man reached first, but Alexander was faster. The Winchester roared. The lead gunman crashed backward through a window in a spray of glass. Gunfire exploded around him. Alexander dropped behind a water trough, working the rifle with practiced rhythm. One man went down screaming, clutching his leg. The last bolted for cover inside the saloon. Then a second voice thundered across the street. "Federal law." Marshal Caldwell stepped out, shotgun in hand, eyes hard as iron. From above, Rollins appeared on the hotel balcony, his calm mask gone, replaced by desperation. "Kill them," he shouted. 50 in gold." The street erupted into chaos. Alexander and the marshal moved with deadly precision, cutting through the panicked gunmen. Alexander broke from cover, sprinting toward a wagon beneath the balcony. "Rollins!" he shouted. Rollins turned, grinning, and fired. Pain tore through Alexander's shoulder, spinning him into the snow. The world blurred, but he forced himself to move. Gritting through the agony, he rolled, lifted the Winchester, and fired. The shot struck true. Rollins froze, staring at the spreading red across his coat before collapsing over the railing and hitting the ground below. Silence followed. The remaining men dropped their weapons, surrendering. Moments later, Caldwell hauled Alexander to his feet. "Stubborn man," he muttered. "Is it done?" Alexander asked. Caldwell nodded toward the body. "Done." Later, inside O'Malley's store, Clara rushed to Alexander, tears spilling as she saw the blood. "It's over," he said softly, holding her close. Behind them, Martha handed the ledger to the marshal. "End it," she whispered. Caldwell took it with a grim nod. Outside, the wind carried away the last of the gun smoke. For the first time, they were free. The winter of 1883 eventually broke, yielding to a vibrant, blooming spring that painted the Wyoming plains in vivid shades of green and gold. The Broken Spur Ranch didn't just survive, it thrived. With the bounty money Marshal Caldwell secured for them from the dismantling of Rollins's syndicate, Alexander expanded the herds and built a sprawling wraparound porch on the timber house. Martha Higgins lived for 3 more years, spending her days sitting on that sun-drenched porch, knitting blankets for the 2 grandchildren that soon filled the house with laughter. When she finally passed, she did so in her sleep, free of fear, surrounded by love. Alexander and Clara Montgomery became pillars of the Cheyenne community. Their love, forged in the brutal crucible of a frontier winter and the shadow of a deadly past, grew into a legend whispered among the locals. They were a testament to the fact that out in the untamed West, a man's word was his bond, and that true family wasn't just born of blood, it was chosen, defended, and cherished against all odds.